Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Ruscio, the president of Washington & Lee, and this is a special day for us, a very significant moment in the university's history. It's been 2 years in the making, and I'm sure there were times when Roger Mudd was wondering if it would indeed come. He discovered virtues of patience he didn't know he had, and my assurances that we wanted to get it right were, I suspect, only somewhat comforting. But we do want to get this right, this Center for Ethics. We are in this for the long haul, and while W&L has long had an interest in the teaching of ethics, dating back to the Society and the Professions program begun by Lou Hodges and directed in recent years by Greg Cooper, the establishment of this center represents an even deeper commitment, an embrace of the proposition that a college education, and a Washington & Lee education in particular, should provide students with the capacity to reason through the toughest moral and ethical questions history has had to offer. The activities and the direction of the center will unfold in the years ahead under the watchful guidance of our faculty and its director, Professor Angela Smith, whom I will introduce in just a moment. My confidence in them allowed me to confidently say to Roger that if you give the university this opportunity, we will live up to the trust you have placed in your alma mater. Generations of students, faculty, and alumni will be grateful for his vision and his generosity. I look forward to what will unfold, to the events and the programs we will put together, to the courses our faculty will develop, to the research they will undertake, to the visitors we will welcome, to watching our graduates become voices in their communities and their professions on matters of ethics. But while I look forward to what the center will do, let me say a word about what it will not do. Our pride in forming this center should not be mistaken for hubris. We undertake this task with humility and in a spirit of inquiry. From the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to Kant, Mill, Rawls, and many, many others, the greatest minds of our civilization have wrestled with and debated the most fundamental questions of moral thought, of right and wrong, of justice and injustice, of obligation and responsibility. We join those debates in full force and with enthusiasm, but also without the pretense that we are destined to settle them. We seek to elevate our students' appreciation of those questions and their own capacity to address them independently. And perhaps along the way, we can hope to elevate the public discourse on these matters. We stand firmly on the proposition that ethics, integrity, and moral imagination are central to a healthy, strong society. But to claim that we know all the answers and will distribute them with missionary zeal would be a conceit doomed to failure, an arrogance I hope we are incapable of. My wish is that in the near future and far beyond, our students will say that their lives were enriched by having had the opportunity during their time at W&L to grapple with challenging moral and ethical dilemmas as preparation for those that they will inevitably face throughout their lives, and that they develop the courage of their convictions, but also the humility to question their own assumptions and learn from others. An ethical life is one of intellectual confidence, but also one of constant inquiry and examination. It is a matter of the heart and moral sensibility, to be sure, but also one of the intellect and the capacity to reason. We are fortunate that Professor Angela Smith has agreed to lead the center during these important formative years. A magna cum laude graduate of Willamette University with majors in philosophy and political science, she earned a PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 1999. She began her teaching career at the University of Washington, where she spent 10 years and became a tenured member of the philosophy department. In 2008, she came to Washington & Lee as a visiting associate professor of philosophy and a fellow in the Society of the Professions program. In 2013, she was appointed the first Roger Mudd Professor of Ethics and the first director of the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics. She teaches a variety of courses in moral and political philosophy as well as ancient philosophy, and her research interests concern the connections between morality, moral agency, and moral responsibility. Her work has been published in a number of the leading journals in philosophy, including Ethics, Philosophical Studies, and the Journal of Ethics, as well as a number of edited Oxford volumes. In 2013, she received a fellowship from the National Endowment for Humanities to conduct summer research, as well as a Lawrence S. Rockefeller Faculty Fellowship to spend the 2013-2014 school year at the Princeton Center for Human Values. She's currently working on the book with the working title, Attitude Matters, Responsibility, Respect, and Reconciliation. And she's also working with two colleagues at the University of Arizona and Florida State University on an edited book entitled The Nature of Moral Responsibility. She's an accomplished teacher and scholar who, in her short time at Washington and Lee, has earned the respect of students and colleagues across the campus. She is ideally suited to lead a new interdisciplinary center that will encourage and enhance serious study and conversation on a wide variety of ethical issues. She's taken a sabbatical from her sabbatical to join us for this inaugural event, and I now introduce her to introduce our distinguished visitor. Angie.
Well, I want to thank President Ruscio for his warm and generous introduction and for the confidence he has placed in me to lead this important new center at Washington and Lee University. I share both his excitement and his humility as we embark upon this new venture, and I'm so grateful for the vision and leadership he has shown over the last 2 years in making ethical inquiry such a central component of the university's overall mission. Let me also express my sincere gratitude to Roger Mudd, whose generous gift has made this all possible. At a time when colleges and universities are under increasing pressure to demonstrate that they are producing graduates with marketable skills that will be of use in today's competitive global economy, Roger's gift reminds us that it is equally, if not more important, that we provide our graduates with the tools and resources to think freely, critically, and humanely about the complex ethical questions they will inevitably face in the world today. So Roger, thank you so much for your gift. So before introducing our inaugural lecturer, I also want to take a moment to express my gratitude to a few other people who have played an important role in making this day possible. First, I would like to thank Professor Bob Strong, who was the interim provost here during the planning stages for the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics, and who worked tirelessly to ensure that this center received the institutional support necessary to turn Roger's vision into a reality. Bob is currently on a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Grant as the Mary Ball Washington Professor of History at University College Dublin. I know he would have loved to be here today, and so I send him my sincere thanks from across the pond. I also owe a debt of gratitude to Susan Pierbeck, Barb Malika, and Debbie Friedman, all of whom have provided crucial support to me this year as I've been working on Mudd Center activities long distance while on sabbatical at Princeton University. This day simply would not have been possible without their amazing talents and support, and I thank them. So let me turn then to the main event. I feel so honored and fortunate to have Professor Michael Ignatieff here to give the inaugural lecture for our new Roger Mudd Center for Ethics. As the mission statement on the inside of your program makes clear, the purpose of this center is to foster serious inquiry into and thoughtful conversation about important ethical issues in public and professional life. It seeks, moreover, to encourage a multidisciplinary perspective on ethics that is informed by both theory and practice. In light of these aims, I cannot think of a person who is better suited to speak to us today than Michael. Michael's career has been nothing short of astonishing. Indeed, it is difficult for me to believe that this is the career of a single person and not that of a collection of individuals who just happen to share the same name. In fact, it was only after teaching Michael's insightful work on the moral complexities of humanitarian intervention for several years that it dawned on me that this was the very same Michael Ignatieff who had written a moving novel about the horrors of ethnic violence in the Balkans that I had read several years before. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Let me mention just a few highlights of his amazing career, and we could spend the whole time here talking about it, but I'll just pick out a few. As an academic, Michael has a PhD in history from Harvard. Michael has held posts at Cambridge, the London School of Economics, Harvard University, and the University of Toronto, among other schools, and has published over a dozen academic books on topics ranging from the ethics of punishment to political economy and the Enlightenment, to issues of nationalism, to human rights and the war on terror. In addition to this academic work, however, he has also engaged in important policy work relating to human rights and international ethics. In 2001, he was a member of the International State Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which made a significant contribution to the development of the responsibility to protect doctrine that has recently been affirmed in the United Nations General Assembly. And he is currently the Centennial Chair of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, which involves leading an ambitious 3-year project that connects public intellectuals, business leaders, policymakers, religious leaders, students, and educators from across the globe to explore how shared ethical and moral values can be incorporated into action to confront international challenges. As I just mentioned, he has also published a number of novels, including his poignant exploration of the ravages of Alzheimer's disease in his book, Scar Tissue, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1993. In addition, while living in Britain from 1978 to 2000, Michael became a well-known journalist and documentary filmmaker. His documentary, Blood and Belonging: Journeys into the New Nationalism, aired on BBC in 1993 and won the Canadian Gemini Award. And as if this wasn't enough, I mean, this is one lifetime, people. In 2006, Michael was elected to the Canadian House of Commons, and just 2 years later became the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and the leader of the official opposition. Thus, I hope you will agree with me that Michael has a wealth of experience to draw upon in inaugurating a center devoted to the theoretical and practical investigation of public and professional ethics. Michael is going to talk with us today on the topic of American democracy, human rights, and the use of force. Please join me in welcoming him.
Mr. President, thank you. Angie, thank you. Roger, if I may call you that, be that familiar with you, thank you. Thank you not only for your generosity, but for an exemplary career in journalism. I think there isn't a person in this room who doesn't understand what you contributed to the public life of your country. And I want to acknowledge that with gratitude and affection. I would like to have there's a camera up there which is putting this up on the web, and I wish that the people watching this on the web could see what an incredibly splendid and historic venue this is. And my thanks to W&L, did I pronounce that properly? I've been rehearsing that in front of the mirror for days. I want to thank the W&L community for coming out, and I see some cadets from another very distinguished institution, the VMI, Virginia Military Institute. I thank them for being here and thank them for their public service, and I thank all of you for coming. I am going to talk about American democracy, human rights, and the use of force, and I want to start with bringing it right up to the present. President Obama surprised just about everybody, including his own White House staff, when he announced on the 31st of August of this year that he'd seek authorization from the U.S. Congress to use force against President Assad's chemical weapons in Syria. And I want to discuss that decision with you this afternoon, because I think, in fact, when you unpack that decision, you'll see that it raises some issues that are, I think, central to the kinds of moral tasks that your center, the Mudd Center, is going to consider in the years ahead. And the issue is the role of public opinion and democratic consent in the use of force to protect human rights overseas. Should the president, can the president, act to protect human beings first, or must he always seek public approval and congressional support before he can do so? I want to ask this as a question of moral theory, but first of all, I have to deal with some preliminary constitutional and legal questions. That is, whether the president must seek congressional authorization before he can use force in a case like Syria, where human rights and chemical weapons are at issue, not vital, urgent national security questions. Now, not being a constitutional lawyer and also not being an American, I got to walk into this territory with extreme prudence. But I can't ignore the legal and constitutional questions altogether. The war powers issue has been with you since the drafting of your Constitution. The framers divided the power of the commander-in-chief to direct the use of force from the power to authorize and pay for war, which was the Congress's role. And the framers deliberately separated the conduct of war from its authorization in order to safeguard American democracy from the risk that a president unchecked by Congress would wage costly wars overseas and then use his standing army to become a despot at home. So the founders had a very sound instinct in principle about the damage that war and presidential war powers can do to democracy. But in practice, their solution, which was to separate the war powers into two, has proved a recurrent challenge ever since. Presidents in Congress, as you know, have repeatedly clashed over the war powers issue. The war power resolution that was passed in Congress in 1973 was designed to ensure that America would never be dragged into another Vietnam. But the president at the time, Richard Nixon, vetoed the war powers resolution, and presidents since then have defied its terms and always reserved to themselves the power to take unilateral action in defense of vital American national interests. Now, when so-called humanitarian intervention is involved, where boots on the ground are not being committed, successive presidents have always denied that they needed congressional authorization where no ground troops are involved. President Clinton, for example, authorized Kosovo in 1999 without seeking congressional approval. President Obama did likewise over Libya in 2011. His legal advisor, Harold Coe, argued to Congress that no authorization was needed since no U.S. forces were involved in direct hostilities. On the other hand, when ground troops are involved, as in the 1991 and 2003 Iraq wars, President Bush, father and son, did seek a congressional resolution to support the operation. But notice that they refused to concede that they needed explicit congressional authorization. So this distinction between authorization and support is important legally and politically. When President Obama took his decision over Syria, he also distinguished between authorization and endorsement, seeking the latter, not the former. And I'm going to quote what he said. He said in his speech to the nation on September 10th that he's both the commander-in-chief and, as he said, the president of the world's oldest constitutional democracy. Britain may have a few problems with that, but just pass along. But he then went on, the president then went on, so even though I possess the authority to order military strikes, I believe it was right, in the absence of a direct or imminent threat to our security, to take this debate to Congress. I believe our democracy is stronger when the president acts with the support of Congress, and I believe that America acts more effectively abroad when we stand together. He then added, this is especially true after a decade that put more and more war-making powers in the hands of the president and more burdens on the shoulders of our troops, while sidelining the people's representatives from the critical decisions about when we use force. So that was the president's decision, but as you know, it was widely criticized and highly controversial. It was criticized for weakening the authority of the presidency and for reducing the capacity of the United States to act decisively overseas. In a much noticed comment in Foreign Policy, an analyst called David Rothkopf exclaimed, Obama's decision may have done more for better or worse to dial back the imperial presidency than anything his predecessors at Congress have done for decades. Now, to this Canadian outsider, this criticism seems a little overblown to me. This is the president, after all, who's carried the war against al-Qaeda to its sanctuaries in Yemen and Pakistan. This is the president who authorized the raid by U.S. forces that captured and killed Osama bin Laden. In those cases where the national security of the United States was at stake, this president has made full use of his executive prerogatives and has done so without prior congressional authorization. And Congress has usually accepted this, that the president must have discretionary authority to commit the use of force in cases like that. The real issue is not here. The real issue is whether the president can act unilaterally as commander-in-chief when the mission is protecting civilians in foreign countries from chemical weapons attacks or other gross human rights abuses. In other words, I'm trying to distinguish, obviously, between wars of necessity and wars of choice, and asking a question about what degree of democratic consent is required for wars of choice. And as we've seen in wars of choice, presidents have used unilateral authority in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and Libya. So the question first is whether the president's decision to seek congressional authorization in Syria created a precedent that will hamper the ability of future presidents to use force to protect civilians in danger overseas. And from my point of view, that's not quite the issue. It's not obvious to me that the White House has created a precedent that imposes new limitations on the president's powers. And I say that simply because presidents of either party have always been robust in the defense of their powers, whatever party they come from, and we can expect that all presidents in the future will be robust in exercising their powers as commander-in-chief in the future. But here's the issue. Will they do so in human rights cases overseas if they sense that the public is no longer with them? The issue is not the precedent the president may or may not have created in September. It's whether there's been a sea change in public opinion on the issue of defending human rights with force overseas. Many observers of public opinion in the United States maintain that a sea change is occurring in the United States in the public's willingness to use military force to protect human rights overseas. But let's remember, as we enter this difficult question of assessing what we the people, you the people, think about this issue, we need to, as a starting point, remember that Americans have always been reluctant to use force to protect human rights of other people overseas, always. It's worth remembering, for example, over Kosovo and Bosnia, that only 43% of the public was in favor of the Kosovo air operation before it started. Support for it increased once it became a success, but let's never forget that when it was initiated, the president was out on a public opinion limb and very perilous position. So if support for discretionary wars of choice to defend human rights has never been strong to begin with, after Iraq and Afghanistan, support has waned even further. And so when Congress returned from its recess in September, after listening to voters, the message they got was that the public wanted as little as possible to do with wars of choice. And the same appears to be occurring not just in the United States, but in other countries. When UK Prime Minister Cameron went to his parliament to seek approval for the use of force, he got voted down. But it's worth pausing here to notice that a serious moral issue is at stake. Let's recall the president's own description of the human rights abuses that he was seeking to correct when he sought authorization for the use of force in Syria. And I'm quoting the president. And he's talking about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And he says, "The images from this massacre are sickening. Men, women, children lying in rows, killed by poison gas. Others foaming at the mouth, gasping for breath. A father clutching his dead children, imploring them to get up and walk." Can it really be the case that American public opinion is indifferent to horror on this scale? If the president says he needs democratic consent for military force and the public refuse it in a case as flagrant as this, the consequences for innocent civilians around the world are going to be severe. And so we at last reach the issue that I'm trying to frame for you this evening, which is, should the just cause of human rights defense be placed at the mercy of democratic consent? Should action in a just cause require democratic ratification? Because the fact here is that many discretionary uses of force that did save lives could not have happened, in my judgment, had the president first asked for democratic approval. There are occasions, this is why it's a real issue, there are occasions, in other words, when democratic deliberation makes it harder, even impossible, to do the right thing and do it in time. And that's why when America's done the right thing in protecting human rights overseas, it's done so through an exercise of presidential prerogative rather than after congressional authorization. For many advocates of intervention overseas in the defense of human rights, sidestepping democratic deliberation is actually justified and justifiable. The justice of the cause, whether it be Darfur or Congo or Libya or the Balkans, seems so overwhelming that waiting for citizens to awake from their torpor and embrace the cause just seems unacceptable. And it also seems outrageous that domestic political consideration should override what is a morally overwhelming case for action. The practical fact may be, as an analyst has written, that, quote, political demands, primarily partisanship and ideological distance from the president, often trump the normative exigencies of intervention. But for a human rights defender, political games ought not to trump just cause. And, as I have to repeat, the humanitarian interventions of the post-Cold War period, Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, all depended on the executive discretion of the American president and upon an elite consensus in favor of action that did not seek to enlist democratic support. And by foregoing an appeal for democratic support, by foregoing an appeal to Congress, the president was actually able to save lives. And so without his capacity to act and the military capability that goes with it, people might still be dying in the Balkans. And the people of Libya might still be living under a tyrant. So if you think this line of reasoning through, if the American public now recoils from the defense of human rights overseas, and if President Obama follows their lead and makes congressional authorization a necessary condition for the dispatch of force, the consequences may be civil wars overseas raging unchecked, dictators getting away with murder, ethnic cleansing, and massacre becoming the standard operating procedure for tyrants seeking to survive. And this is a gloomy prospect, especially for those, someone like me, who believe that humanitarian interventions of the 1990s actually did stop some killing and did save some lives. And this reluctance of the public to support intervention also poses a challenge to the consensus that emerged at the end of the 1990s that states have a responsibility to promote and protect human rights. Angie's kindly referred to the fact that I was one of the members of the International Commission on Sovereignty and Intervention that in 2001 defined a new norm of sovereign responsibility that makes all states responsible for preventing mass atrocity crimes. And this wasn't just a UN talking shop. It's had consequences. It has been authoritatively endorsed by heads of state meeting at the UN. It's part of the boilerplate of international commitments, and more to the point, the President of the United States has created a thing called the Atrocity Prevention Board, which meets every week and is meeting now to coordinate atrocity prevention activity across the full range of the American government. So this is not just talk, it's actually proceeding to action. And the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was the idea of a former colleague of mine, Samantha Power, now the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, seeks to operationalize the idea that states have a responsibility to protect other citizens in other countries from atrocity crimes. And that follows the instinct of our commission. We sought to change the existing language of international relations from a right to intervene to a responsibility to protect. And that change of language is not unimportant. It sought to capture the idea that intervention should stop being understood as a discretionary matter of conscience and become a compulsory obligation of states when human beings are faced with an ultimate threat to their lives. But here's the point. The hard truth is that a peremptory norm, an obligation to protect, simply cannot be reconciled with democratic consent, with the right of citizens to decide when and where to use force and put their men and women in harm's way. Democratic peoples put their own rights as citizens ahead of their duties to other peoples. It's just a natural fact. It's true here, it's true in my country, it's true around the world. And if they accept a duty to others, it's an imperfect obligation, one they fulfill if they can, meaning that they balance obligation against prudence and calculations of risk. And the place they do this balancing is democratic debate. It's noticeable in retrospect that when our commission, this UN commission, defined the criteria of legality and legitimacy for intervention overseas, we insisted that the UN Security Council authorization was the sine qua non for international legality, but we said nothing about democratic consent as the sine qua non of domestic legitimacy. So I'm kind of criticizing 20 years of thinking on this subject. Now that both the United States Congress and the British Parliament have demonstrated their reluctance to use force, it's evident, in my view, that human rights intervention faces a crisis of democratic legitimacy. If public opinion is balking at wars of choice, I think we then need to step back. Here's the next step in the argument. We need to step back and distinguish more carefully what the American public is actually saying about using force in defense of human rights overseas. We need to be much more precise about what kind of sea change has occurred in American attitudes to intervention. Polling by the Pew organization showed that Americans were opposed to military strikes in Syria by a margin of 48 to 29. Gallup's numbers were rather similar, 51 to 36. And opposition in Britain ran at about the same level. So skepticism is strong not just in your country, but in all democratic countries that have the capability and experience of intervening. Now, why is this skepticism in place? I mean, obviously, the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan does a lot to explain what's driving these numbers. But we need to be more precise about what it was about Iraq and Afghanistan that has left so many members of the American public coldly skeptical about intervening at all overseas. And here I want to make use of a wonderful economist and philosopher, Albert O. Hirschman of Princeton, made a wonderful distinction between 3 reasons to decline to do something. He said, first of all, futility. You can't make anything better. Jeopardy. You'll risk what you've already achieved. Perversity. You'll just make things worse. Over Iraq and Afghanistan, it seems to me the American public has bitter experience of all 3. Intervention in these places is easily portrayed as an example of futility, jeopardy, and perversity all rolled up into one horrible, costly bundle. On top of these 3 factors, however, there's a 4th reason why Iraq and Afghanistan have left Americans disillusioned with interventions overseas. And that's the most serious reason of all. That is the manipulation of their democratic consent. Americans were told that Iraqi weapons of mass destruction in the hands of a homicidal dictator who had used them before on his own people, namely the Kurds, posed a clear and present danger to the United States and to international peace and security. That was the case put to the UN Security Council by Secretary Powell, and it was the case put to Congress when it authorized force in March 2003. There was only one problem with this case. There weren't any weapons of mass destruction, as you know. And so when American and British publics learned this, they felt that they'd been lied to, felt that their sons and daughters had been sacrificed for a fabrication. It's hard to think of anything more serious a matter than that. Members of the Bush administration, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Powell, Mrs. Rice, the former president, continue to insist to this day that there's a difference between a lie and an honest mistake. But the American public, and also public overseas, believes deeply that their consent was manipulated with disastrous results. Now, the defense of human rights was a subsidiary element in the case made for intervention both in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a lot of talk, you'll remember, about freeing people from the yoke of a dictator and educating women and things like that. These motives were secondary to the perceived or invented national security threat. But after Iraq and after Afghanistan, after the manipulation of consent, the American public is skeptical, and for very good reason, when advocates of intervention press human rights language into the service of their cause. So if we sum up American attitudes to the use of force in the wake of Iraq, I am reminded of a line from a song that I used to listen to a lot when I was 21 by the British rock band The Who, "We Won't Be Fooled Again." That does seem to me to capture something visceral in American and British and to some extent Canadian attitudes towards the use of force. But let's drill a little deeper now, because that's not the end of the story. If we turn now from opinions about Iraq to Syria and start asking what it is that Americans are skeptical about in relation to Syria, I think we need to make some elementary distinctions. Opposing the use of force does not necessarily mean Americans are indifferent to the slaughter of civilians and the use of chemical weapons. The polls that I just cited to you by Pew and Gallup are not measuring the strength of American conscience, they're measuring the strength of American prudence, and those are 2 different things. The cause might be just, Americans could be saying, but we can't do much to stop a ruthless dictator from gassing his own people, and if we try, it'll drag us into a civil war where there are no obvious friends, just plenty of enemies. So to use the language of just war theory, Americans may concede that the cause is just, they just deny that there are any reasonable prospects for doing anything about it. But it's important to distinguish between these two rationales, because if it's the case, and I hope it is, then the poll data is not indicating moral indifference on the part of democratic publics around the world, simply prudence. And if it's measuring prudence, then democratic deliberation is doing exactly what democratic deliberation has to do. That's an important point I want to make. The hesitancy here seems to me to be saying something important and very positive about the strength of American and Western democracy. This conception of what's happening to American opinion on Syria, I think, gets reinforcement from the research of Bruce Gentleson and some colleagues about preceding debates about the use of force. Their insight has always been, and I think this is a useful term, their insight has been that the principal policy objective must make sense to the American people before they support sending troops overseas. Where that policy objective, for example, drags Americans into someone else's civil war, support will always be low. When the policy objective relates to defending clearly defined national interests, support tends to be high. And this is important because it's sometimes said the key critical variable is what is dreadfully known as the body count, simply risk aversion on the part of the American people. Gentelson's research is saying, in fact, if the principal policy objective is clear, Americans are prepared to use force and are prepared to take the risks commensurate with the use of force. And this seems to be another important principle. But it helps you to clarify what's at stake in Syria. Over Syria, the president has struggled to define precisely a principal policy objective that Americans can understand. He's explicitly stated, and I quote, "We're not contemplating putting our troops in the middle of someone else's civil war." But that's precisely what Americans think will happen if targeted strikes are used in Syria, that bit by bit our sleeve will be caught in the mangle, as my mother used to say. So the cause may be just, Americans may be saying, but the president has not convinced them that he has a coherent strategy, and in the absence of one, citizens can't support the use of force. This is again a different analysis from one that says Americans have become morally indifferent or isolationist. It says that they need to see a coherent principal policy objective and a strategy that supports it. This analysis suggests, in turn, four rough and ready conclusions of mine. First of them is that democratic deliberation is doing the job it must do in disciplining the use of force in relation to human rights objectives. Secondly, that the president has failed to present Americans with a strategy that avoids the trap of futility, jeopardy, and perversity. Third, that if he could present a strategy that avoided those traps, Americans might be willing to support the use of force in defense of human rights in the Middle East. And fourth, that presidential leadership remains as essential as ever in shaping American opinion. These things never stay still, and the Syrian civil war is grinding on. And as it moves from being a conscience-shocking event on the nightly news to an unpleasant banality, the likelihood that the president will present a meaningful strategy in Syria begins to decline. I mean, it's worth pointing out, this is a grim reality, I think, of moral life, that a horrible civil war not only brutalizes the Syrians, we can see that clearly enough, but it also brutalizes us. It brutalizes the conscience. It desensitizes the conscience. It produces apathy and disengagement. And this makes a ceasefire in Geneva in November all the more important, because we can see this going on and on with Western publics becoming more and more detached, the body count rising in Syria, and something truly awful happening. And if that goes on, Syria then becomes a portent of what the world looks like in a post-American world, a world where the U.S. loses the capacity and the will to coordinate and restrain principals and agents in a strategically important zone of the world. And we may be in a post-American world if this grinds on with unfurling consequences throughout the Middle East. I make this particularly grim point to make another obvious point. After Iraq and after Afghanistan, even after Libya, we all know it's burned into us by loss and death, futility, jeopardy, and perversity. We all know that interventions can turn out very badly. But after Syria, we know that doing nothing turns out badly too. And there's an important difference between this. When we intervene, at least some of the consequences are borne by us, whereas when we don't, the consequences are borne exclusively by those we failed to assist. And those who believe as I do in the responsibility of states to protect citizens in other nations when their own state is unwilling or unable to do so, have arrived at a moment of truth and a moment of choice, how far to push the priority of responsibility over the requirement of democratic consent. What I'm saying to you is that to a degree that interveners, and some of us call us liberal hawks, but to the degree that we have been advocates for intervention, I don't think we have honestly addressed the fact that the practical exercise of responsibility in the international order has depended on discretionary exercises of authority by the President of the United States. Without those exercises of authority, no alliance of democratic states to protect victims has ever been credible. So the entire future of intervention depends essentially on the will of the American people, in my judgment. Now here we get to another feature of this, which is that foreign policy has always been, in the United States and everywhere else, an elitist pursuit, a debate conducted in the confines of universities, research centers, think tanks, elite newspapers, and journals. And the object of foreign policy debate has been to influence and inflect the president's enormous discretionary authority to use force. Those in favor of intervention have played this game brilliantly for the last 20 years, with the object being to sway all the decision makers up into the Oval Office. But in the process, interventionists have failed to make the case to the American people, or simply assume that if they won the battle in Washington, it doesn't matter what the American people think. One lesson to be drawn, I think, from nearly 20 years of intervention policy, some of which have succeeded and some of which have failed, the simple lesson is you need to bring the people with you. And when you don't, when they feel their consent has been manipulated or ignored, you undermine democratic faith itself, but you also undermine the moral solidarity towards civilians in danger on which the strategy of protection actually depends. So there's sound democratic reasons for believing that just causes must always be put through a rigorous process of testing by public opinion, and not simply the groupthink of elite adjudication in Washington. Let's not be sentimental here about democracy. Democracy does not perform miracles. It is notorious that there is no correlation between democratic deliberation and the right result. Deliberation does not make groupthink impossible, and it does not save nations from self-inflicted mistakes. There is no reliable escape from tragedy here. At the same time, democratic deliberation can slow down the Gadarene rush of hot conviction and elite arrogance. It can prevent the language of just cause from sweeping all before it. Because it is a fact of moral life that no just cause is self-validating, and certainly none is self-executing. Citizens simply disagree about the use of force. The justice of any cause may be obvious to some, but it is not obvious to all, and in a democracy it is the justice of a cause has to be sufficiently self-evident to a majority for it to become the kind of cause young men and women can be asked to die for. It's downright dangerous to take your own moral scruples as not requiring validation, and the point of democracy is precisely to subject competing principles to an institutionalized process of adversarial justification. This process of adversarial justification, that is, show the people the cause is just, is the moral heart of democracy. Immanuel Kant observed in 1795 that republics were less likely to go to war than monarchies because when the people had a voice in the decision to go to war, they would oppose the rush to battle, as subjects of a monarchy could not. And Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America built on Kant's insight when he wrote in the 1830s, quote, "There are two things that a democratic people will always have trouble doing, beginning a war and ending it." As Tocqueville wisely foresaw, democratic reluctance to fight, coupled with an implacable determination when the fight is joined, has been the organizing force of the American experience of the great wars of the past century. The U.S. did not enter either World War I or World War II until 3 years in, but when it did, it became the engine of victory. And Americans have great reason to be proud, both of being reluctant to fight and implacably determined when Americans do commit. But again, there are no easy answers here, and it's important not to cloak that tradition in a sentimental glow. Democratic reluctance to use force may save lives, but it does impose consequence on others. Just imagine how Winston Churchill and the British people felt as they watched the American giant hesitating on the sidelines while they faced Hitler alone. The price of democratic deliberation can sometimes be delay, and it can sometimes be worse than delay. When citizens decide to stay on the sidelines of other people's fights, someone pays the price. And it is a limitation of democracy that citizens invariably price the cost to themselves more accurately than they price the cost to others. But this is where we are at with a democracy. A democratic system at least requires us to deliberate together as to whether violence can ever be justly used in the defense of higher goals. Nothing in democratic deliberation guarantees that we will get the answer right and avoid disaster and tragedy for ourselves or for others. But the alternative to a democratic foreign policy is one run by the best and the brightest, by people who take their cleverness and the justice of their cause for granted, by people who think they know better than the people who elect them. And we know where that arrogance is led, and so we have reason to believe that when decisions about using force overseas must be made in defense of the human rights of strangers, let them be made by the people and their representatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Professor Ignatieff has agreed to take a couple questions here. I think we have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and say them here, and he will try to then say them into the microphone so everyone can hear.
Don't be shy. The object is not to reduce you to stunned silence. Sir?
I thought for a moment you were in favor of selective assassination.
Huh. No. The question was whether I'm in favor of selective assassination. No, I'm most emphatically not, and I think Americans are very troubled by aspects of the war on terror that look like selective assassination. This is a country in which military force is properly constrained by the rule of law and the laws of war. That's what you get taught at BMI, if I'm not mistaken. That's what we believe. It is very, very difficult to constrain violent military force with law, but if we don't get into trouble. The United States is at war with people who do not scruple to game our compliance with the rules. But I think it's extremely important that, to put it simply, I've written elsewhere that one of the paradoxes that is most difficult to understand in a war on terror is that democracy always fights with one arm tied behind its back. And the paradox is that that's how you win. It's very hard to get that and accept that, but that is what I believe. You have to put lawful limitations on the use of force in order for force to be just. It limits what you can do, but that's how you win the battle for hearts and minds. That's how you maintain democratic consent. That's how you maintain democratic legitimacy. And it's an ongoing and tremendous discipline. Sometimes you fall over one side, but if you understand that, you will prevail against these people. Sir?
As we know, the executive branch is certainly not free from scandal, and so I was wondering to what extent you are concerned with putting more power in the hands.
Well,
What was the question?
the question is whether I'm concerned about putting more hands in the power of the executive branch, because it is, I think your phrase was, plagued by scandal or dogged by scandal. Not free from scandal. That was very delicately put. I was teaching a class this afternoon in Professor Connolly's class with 10 students from WNL. Did I get that right? And we were talking about Madison, and we were talking about one of the core faiths that Madison had, which is proven to be true, is that institutions turn out to be tremendously important. Character, the individual character of occupants of these offices, the president, members of Congress, senators, may be defective. Why? Because we're human beings, and all of us are defective and sinful characters. And Madison had a deep sense of our fallibility as individuals and the sense of the fallibility of the people we elect to hold office. But he had great faith in institutions, and it's precisely at this point that I think we should have faith in institutions. It is maddening sometimes to feel that the war power is split, but it's deliberately split. It's split so that no one can define causes as just and sweep past democratic deliberation and debate. Congress is a very imperfect vessel, and at the moment I think Americans feel very skeptical of their Congress. But Madison's point was, believe in the institutional checks and balances that the system imposes on weak and fallible characters, and that's all you can do. And this republic has been going over 200 years on that. I think because the institutions work better than the men and women who work in them. And that is a crucial Madisonian insight, which I think has to guide us as we think about these issues. Sir?
Is there enough democratic capital, U.S. or others, to have the responsibility to protect everyone? If not, how do you choose who you protect, and where's the line?
Is there enough democratic capital to protect everybody? And if you can't protect everybody, how do you choose? Which is a terrific question. The commission of which I was a part said, we can't protect all human rights. So we made a selection. We did what the doctors call a triage. We said that the crimes that states have an obligation to prevent, stop, and punish are genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, ethnic massacre. In other words, the range of human rights abuses that states can have an obligation to protect and remedy is a narrow set of the most conscience-shocking crimes. So that narrows the range, but there's an additional element of triage. And those of you who study just war theory will know how this works. The cause may be just, You may have the right intentions, you may have the right authority, but if you don't have reasonable prospects of success, you can't do it. Prudent considerations of what is possible are always appropriate in limiting the use of force. There are people dying of human rights abuses and mass human rights violations around the world. Historically, the good news is that is declining. There is less of this butchery going on now than there was in the 1960s. But it's still going on. So your question is pertinent. How do you choose among these places? You choose the worst violations, and you choose those cases where you have a reasonable prospect of stopping them. And in the Syrian case, absolutely conscious, shocking atrocities are going on every day. But nobody has delivered a strategy of military intervention or use of force that has reasonable prospects of stopping it. And that's where we are. So I think we can choose and we can be prudent. That would be how I would answer the question. Sir?
As an historian, I would wonder, and perhaps you can give us some parallels, as we look at history, and particularly the last 2 centuries, Britain with an interventionist policy worldwide, numbers of colonial wars, those sorts of things eventually culminated in the First World War, essentially broke them as a great empire. If we look at modern America and the systemic changes we've seen in the last 60 years, Nuremberg, which allows for limited sovereignty and intervention in the affairs of other countries, and of course the President signed the Monroe Doctrine, Mass Atrocity Response Doctrine, 2 years ago, which gives inside the United States, of course, a legal framework for bringing these sorts of things even before Congress, or acting as an independent executive. Would you see us in a position, the U.S., the small us, big us, in a position where a excitable and an extensive interventionist policy would eventually break our contribution to the rest of the world? And in fact, we would lose power by the overuse of it.
Yeah, that's a very... The question was whether there are analogies between British imperial overuse of intervention and American overuse of intervention, bringing about essentially the decline of American power analogous to the decline of British power. I simplify. I think the British Empire was brought down by a lot more than just too frisky a use of force. And I think it's important to remember that there are some interventions that the British Empire was involved in that do glory to the human race, namely the use of military power to interdict slave ships, to interdict and stop the slave trade. When we talk about humanitarian intervention, we talk as if that's something we invented. No, this has been going on a long way, and some of the best uses of military power in the history of the world were to stop the slave trade and to interdict it. So, needless to say, there are countless other British interventions which awaken bitter and angry memories in anybody who was subject to British colonial rule. My purpose here is not to pronounce absolution on the British Empire. That is pretty foolish. So if over frisky intervention was sometimes a good idea in the British Empire, but in any case was not the cause of its decline, I think the analogy into the States, the United States, isn't going to work. Although I have to say there is no question that Americans of my generation, and I look out at the audience and see some of my generation here, are haunted by what Vietnam did to this country, what Iraq did to the country, what 10 years in Afghanistan has done, the number of veterans who come back wounded in mind and body, the enormous cost in treasure. All these things, we sometimes, I think, feel like Polybius in the late Roman Empire, looking at the slow decline of a great country because of imperial overextension in these cases. So there's something here that is deeply troubling to Americans. And I think that what my lecture is trying to say is that we have to be, everybody has to be extremely prudent about intervention, and it's extremely important to carry the country with you and the people with you. And democratic deliberation is not a guarantee against folly, but it's the only thing we've got. This is a Madisonian point. What else is there but democratic deliberation to restrain us from folly? And I do think that the only thing I don't want to omit is that there have been uses of force by the United States that made an enormous difference to the world. I mean, that is, no one is dying in Bosnia. No one is dying in Kosovo. And they were dying by the hundreds every day for 9 years. And it was stopped basically with the use of American military power, and the use of American diplomacy, and American commitment and will. The Europeans couldn't stop it. Canada wanted to do something, but it was much too small. Let's be honest, the people who stopped the dying in the Balkans was the United States of America, contributed enormously to the stability of Europe and to the consolidation of the post-Cold War peace. And you can even, if you want to get really ambitious about it, argue that Richard Holbrooke's securing of the peace at Dayton in 1995 completed the work begun by George Catlett Marshall in 1948. That's an incredible record. You have the continent whose wars devastated the world for 2 centuries at peace very largely because of the exercise of American power since 1945. And now they're your economic competitors, but that continent is at peace. Well, that's just an enormous contribution. And it was a series of interventions that turned out well. So this is I'm giving you a complicated, long-winded, complicated answer. I just don't think America is faced with polybian imperial decline. I'm saying it's got to be extremely prudent and restrained about using force overseas. But I'm also saying there have been some historical instances where it made a huge difference to your security and the security and freedom of others.
This discussion can continue. We have an open reception over at the Alumni House to which everyone is invited. I hope you will all come over there. I also would like to let you know we have several of Professor Ignatieff's books over there for sale if anyone would like to pick some of those up. In fact, his most recent memoir on his life in Canadian politics has just come out. In fact, I think it was supposed to come out in November here, but we got advance copies, and that book is available over at the Alumni House as well. So once again, please join me in thanking our speaker.